through this, but it's because I didn't want to lecture at you today. And we can talk about this at length next time. It talks, so global studies is a discipline, the notion of scapes in cultural globalization, and observing the global local continuum. So this is the chapter that the book that I'm having you read, and you're reading a chapter within it, okay? And in that book, it talks about the difference between global studies, international relations, and international studies. And for right now, all you need to know is that the GLS program fits pretty squarely in the notion of global studies. Then the question becomes, well, what do we do in global studies? And the answer, according to this book, would be that we focus on globalization and change. We analyze how global trends impact humanity, and we're concerned with the notion of global citizenship. So for right now, let's think about the first two, globalization and trends. Actually, let's think about the middle one, which is trends. In our work, we generally think about trends in terms, three different kinds of ways: economic trends, or political trends, or cultural trends. CCCP tends to focus on the cultural, and I would argue that it's almost impossible to talk about the cultural without talking about the economic and the political, just like Anthony's observation that his sort of experience on the train needs to be contextualized by talking about the different neighborhoods, by talking about history, by talking about economics, etc. So to discuss that, cultural globalization, a useful way to do it is to ask, what are the global scapes that I'm looking at? And this is, the guy who came up with this is named Arjun Appadurai. Preeti says I can't say his name correctly, but I love him and I read all his work. And these are his ideas, and I still think they're super useful. He talks about the world in terms of ethnoscapes, ideoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, and mediascapes. And you can see they're all kind of overlapped. So ethno, think about people, ethnography. Those are the movements of people. It could be from migration, it could be from all kinds of things, and we're going to look at that in the next slide. Ideoscapes have to do with belief systems. Think of the word ideology. Mediascapes are representational and communicative practices. It could be things like, social media, but it could also be dress codes. Technoscapes are movements of technologies, who gets broadband, who gets air conditioning, who gets refrigeration, right? And financescapes are, of course, movements of capital. So each one of these affect the other. So here's an interesting, I made the little chart, but it comes from the discussion that you'll read about in the chapter. It talks about different world migration patterns that have come of late. And if you look at the word in the middle, it says choice, up toward the top. I kind of split this by who chooses to move and who doesn't. So at the very top, you have the concept of sojourner, and you guys are sojourners. These are people who are here for like a temporary stint by choice. Study abroad is the classic sojourner. But then so is working for a multinational. Then you have immigrants. Then you have all the groups of people who tend to get thought of in the sort of the migrant category, right? You've got people who are seeking temporary asylum, you've got refugees, and you've got displaced persons. And it's kind of interesting that displaced persons actually have the least amount of choice because often they are coming from places that it's not just that there was political or human-based turmoil. They're usually, there was like a fire or a drought, or there's nothing to eat, or they tend to be displaced for geological and geographical reasons. Each one of these ethnoscapes that we're looking at here creates new ideoscapes and financescapes and mediascapes and technoscapes. So when study abroad students I remember having the first Russian study abroad students back when the Iron Curtain was up, coming to Albany State. I don't know why they went to Albany State, but we had been taught that Russians were like evil. Um, and that changed our experience. Some of you talked about intersecting as sojourners with people who were refugees, and that changes your view of them. And sometimes it can change their view of you. A lot of the resist movement on social media has been coming as a lot of a huge shock to many people in the greater Muslim world who have been told forever that the U.S. wanted nothing to do with them. It's actually quite shocking that there's, to them to see there's a huge difference of opinion on that. Each one of these, we could make a similar chart with different new ideology patterns or new finance patterns or new media patterns. So for instance, an ideology pattern might be something like feminism or the spread of Islam or inclusion of trans identities. And when you find that a community is more interested and open to your sort of position within those ideologies, you might physically move to those places, or you might invest in those places, or you might develop technologies that align with those kinds of positions. So each one of these can talk to the other. The term that we use to talk about that is the global local continuum. And here's one definition: the tense dynamic between local identity and global ambition. Whether we're talking about religion, art, music, football, it doesn't matter. It's that tension. So I have this thing where I say, use these ideas to deconstruct this question. This is a question I get a lot. How does social media impact user self-esteem? Does it cause us to feel more or less empowered? So, I write about things like selfie culture, and people are like, does it mean we're all narcissistic today? Or does it mean that like Saudi women can now tell their truth, right? And the answer is both and. And the real answer is, which woman are we talking about? Or which person are we talking about? Because each one of those is being, the word is interpolated through a range of different shifting dynamics according to the scapes. So if we're talking about self-esteem, I've got this on the left side. We have things like gender-based identification and interpolation. Of course, that might depend on where you're living or what words are available to describe where you are on a gender continuum. Same thing with racial identification and interpolation. But we can also talk about the self in terms of ideoscapes. So say social discourses about what's appropriate emotionally or healthy in terms of body size or whatever. We could talk about things like class-based identifications that may very well tie to things like finance-scapes and technoscapes. Institutional treatment is always about technology. And then on the other side of it, the social media side, the right side, look at all these different elements. You've got issues about corporate control and technical control and state control and platform norms. Each one of these things intersects into these scapes and needs to be considered when you're talking in a global sense about what people's experiences are. So for your assignment, you don't need to know every one of those things, but you do need to think about the case studies that interest you and talk about how you see them fanning out with regard to some of these issues. So, you see this about the collision of, say, ideoscapes and technoscapes or whatever.